It's Sunday, March 13, 2022. I'm Anthony Davis, and welcome to the fifth episode in this series from Midas Touch and 5-Minute News called The Weekend Show. You can download the show as an audio podcast in addition to the daily 5-Minute News audio podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today is the host of PoliticsGirl podcast and viral breakfast rant videos online, PoliticsGirl herself, Leigh McGowan. Now, typically on the weekend show, we have several topics making the headlines to analyse, but today we're going to reflect on the media itself and how the partisan press and talk radio and cable news has maybe created a false narrative for the American people that is not actually that dissimilar to Vladimir Putin's misinformation campaign on his people, convincing them that Ukraine isn't free and it's run by Nazis who must be overthrown. So, Leigh, let's talk about what we have in common. You know, we both have passion projects. I created 5-Minute News, you created PoliticsGirl, and I think we both were inspired to give people access to accurate information, but most importantly, to try and bring back maybe common sense to just the thinking, as opposed to being drawn by the media in any particular direction. What was your inspiration for the origins of PoliticsGirl?
Well, first of all, Anthony, thank you so much for having me. I absolutely love 5-Minute News. I don't know how you do it every day. When I started Breakfast Rants, I was doing it every day, and my brain was clouded most of the time. So kudos to you for doing it every day, and also for keeping it unbiased. When I started the PoliticsGirl project, I actually started it 7 years ago now on YouTube, and I thought I would do an unbiased point of view. My whole impetus for starting PoliticsGirl in general years ago was the second midterm elections during Obama's second term. And we lost terribly. The Democrats lost terribly in that. And what I found was most of the people that I knew who were educated, well, had a lot of time on their hands, people had no idea what was going on, thought it really didn't matter. They were like, every government's the same, this won't make a difference. And I thought, oh Lord, I mean, if these people I know who have every opportunity to know what's going on don't realize what a big difference this is going to make, what are people who don't have the time, who are working for jobs, who aren't having the ability to be dialed in, what are they thinking? And so I started PoliticsGirl as a YouTube channel to just basically explain government, because I thought when you're checked out, it goes over your head. Everything that's happening goes over your head. You're not paying attention, because it's like learning a new word. When you learn a new word and then suddenly everyone's using that word and you're like, did everyone just start using the word plethora? And you're like, no, that's because you know what that word means now and you're registering it. So it's a little bit like that with politics. I thought once you know, then the things that you hear on the radio, they start getting into your brain. And once you know, then you care. And once you care, then you start making a difference. And I thought, I'll just start with the knowing part. I'll do an education. I'll do civics, you know? And so I did this kind of informational videos online, and it really took off. And it was funny how many people showed their children these videos I made, because, you know, why do we have the Iowa caucus? Why is the Supreme Court important? These kind of things. But that happened to be the year of the primaries. And so as I was going along doing my unbiased opinion of things, all of a sudden Donald Trump is rising in the polls, rising in the polls, rising in the polls. And I thought, oh dear, it's going to be very difficult for me to do something unbiased when I suddenly have a very distinct opinion about what is happening. And I find it quite terrifying. And so somewhere around the 8-month mark, I started being quite opinionated about what was happening. I was terrified for the country that we might end up with this person as president. And I have to say, I was foolish enough to think that it wouldn't actually happen. I really did think, as terrible as the election lead up was to 2016, I thought there's no way Hillary won't end up pulling this out. And I was astounded the night he left. I was watching the results come in, and I just got up and left the room. And my husband said, you know, it's not over. And I was like, it's over. And I went and I had a shower, a really hot, long shower. And I cried for the country. I thought, I cannot believe this happened. And I cried for the Supreme Court, and I cried that such a low life of a man could be placed on such a high position, and I just felt shocked. And then all of a sudden, this project I was doing, it had no place anymore, because everyone and their brother was doing political commentary now. Oh, Donald Trump did this, Donald Trump did that. I mean, every time you would write something, he would do something more inane the next day. And so your thing was out of date before you could even put it up. And I thought, well, Van Jones has 400,000 people working on his stuff. Like, what am I doing by myself? So I took a break. And then coming up on the 2020 election, sometime around the summer, I thought, oh man, I can't do nothing. I have to do something. But there's no room for me just randomly chit-chatting on YouTube. So TikTok had been created. We were in the middle of the pandemic. And I thought, I'll hit up the kids, I'll start talking to them. And I think it was also a partially my husband, because I was following him around the house, screaming about whatever was happening. And he was like, can you put that energy somewhere else? And I thought, where am I supposed to put it? And he said, why don't you put it on TikTok? And I was like, I'm not 21 and I don't dance. And he was like, no, just put the phone somewhere and talk what you're doing to me at the phone. And I did. I put it in my kitchen window and I started just talking about what was going on. And it took off. It became really viral really fast. And I think it's because people, it sort of speaks to what you were saying before, I think it's because people are dying to see themselves reflected in things they see online. They're dying to not be talked down to. They're dying to hear things in their own language. And they're dying to understand, which goes back to my initial impetus to do PoliticsGirl in the first place. People want to understand. But if you give us 17 different, ways of saying the same thing, and they all sound convoluted or they all sound highbrow, you're never going to connect with anyone. And I think that this lady just talking in her kitchen, people were like, yeah, this is exactly what I was just saying, at lunch, but I didn't say it like that.
But it's the authenticity. I mean, this is, if I can tell you for a second what I think it is, because I think that my version of it is going to be slightly different to your version, because I'm a viewer and I watch you religiously. And I completely connected with you because it's authentic. And that is what maybe we weren't getting from the mainstream media, is because people are paid to be on there. And, you weren't being paid. And with me, with 5 Minute News, I wasn't being paid. Like, I felt compelled to do it. And I was interviewed and they said, well, why are you not doing opinion? Like, you spent your whole life on the radio giving your opinion and all of a sudden you're not doing any opinion. And I said, because people are sick of opinion. There's opinion everywhere. What they actually need is just the plain cold facts. So I'm very interested to ask you, because I think there's a difference. You see, the thing is, if a staunch conservative like Republican Trump person would look at what you're doing, they would call you a snowflake and they would call you all of the nasty words, right? But
they've called me a lot worse than that.
I'm sure, but I'm being generous. But what I find interesting is this difference between truth and opinion. And fundamentally, if you're telling the truth, and all I hear from what you do is truth, I don't, or truths, or home truths, or common sense. And you're like, come on, like, why, when did we lose our minds here? And that's how I feel all the time. I feel like the world lost its mind, and I'm the only sane person. And that's why it's nice to watch other people, journalists who've gone rogue in many cases. That's often the case. Like, I used to work for the networks. Like, you move on and you just like, I want to be completely independent of all of this noise. So I see your passion and I see your authenticity. And I get a sense that maybe this is where it needs to go. And this is why, this is the difference between, I hate the phrase mainstream media because we're all mainstream, hopefully. The alternative to mainstream media is these small stations like, the OAN or Newsmax or even Fox, which are propaganda stations.
Yeah, they should be considered fringe.
Is it possible to do what you do and still be unbiased? Is your bias about politics and partisan politics, or is your bias about common sense? Because your fear and the reason you cried in the shower wasn't because you hate Republicans, I guess. It's because you knew that guy was going to take the country to a place that was completely at odds with where it should be heading, right?
Right. Yeah, no, I think the thing is that I would never, at this point, like I said, I started my first project completely unbiased. I started it from a place, because I really do believe you can be nonpartisan. But the way our country has gone, it's not possible now. It's not possible to be not on one side or the other. There is no real middle ground between potential Christian fascism and, regular American democracy. There's no well, let's just have a little fascism. There's no middle ground there, Ron DeSantis can either say trans people can't exist or we can't. Do you know what I mean? Right. You can either say women have the right to their own body or we don't. And Missouri just passed a law that said you can't leave the state if you're pregnant. There's no middle ground. Well, maybe we can sort of leave the state. No, you either can leave the state or you can't leave the state. We're either free or we're not free. And the fact that we have a party that's saying, I'm traumatized by the tyranny of wearing this mask, but also women can't leave my state. Those two things, they don't go together. So it has nothing to do with partisanship or partisan politics at this point. It's about morality. It's about decency. It's about who you are as a person. Like you said, I cried in the shower because we had put a criminal in charge of our country. We had put a madman, a narcissist, a self-involved, uncurious person, someone who really, truly just was in it for himself. And you put someone in a position of power who only thinks of themselves, you're in a lot of trouble. And the country has, I think about all the people that say, what damage can he really do in 4 years? Well, I mean,
the legacy will be with us for a generation or two. But why were Republicans prepared to overlook that? I mean, why were evangelical Christians prepared to overlook his sexual behavior? The grab him by the pussy line, all of that stuff. Why were they prepared to overlook that stuff? I mean, it was a known crime family in New York. I mean, I have friends who lived in New York, and they were like, "Yeah, everybody knows that's the crime family, Trump crime family."
Listen, I think our media doesn't help. You talk about mainstream media. I think the problem is that most people don't have the time to be truly informed. Most people are just living their life as best they can. They want to take care of their family. They want to do well. They want to stay healthy. They want to take care of their kids. They want their kids to have a good life. They don't have time to know, which is one of the reasons I started the project in the first place. And I think there's a fair amount of people who saw Donald Trump as a successful businessman. He was the guy from The Apprentice. I think there are a fair amount of people who didn't know anything past that. You didn't have to read that much to know that he stiffed every person that worked for him, from the caterer from his wedding to the people who made pianos for his casinos. He was terrible to the working man. I mean, truly appalling. But you had to look a little farther than what you were reading. I mean, you would think saying I could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose a single voter would turn people off. Apparently not. You would think that saying grab women by the pussy would turn people off. Apparently not. Every time I thought he was done, he wasn't done. And so I wonder if the country was just in a far worse place than I thought it was, and that he was the id of so many people who wanted to hear people degraded, who wanted to talk down to women, who were sick of this. There's an entire group of people now who are cheering on Putin. I mean, he just invaded a country, a sovereign democratic country. He's bombing maternity wards. And yet there's people that are like, yeah, but that guy's a strongman leader. They love that kind of, and there's, Jon Stewart was recently on Kara Swisher's Sway, and he said, there's a lot of people who for years have been closer to Putin than Pelosi. They would rather have a Putin type presidency than this kind of democratic, multicultural, woke world that we are offering. We're saying everyone is equal. And if you want to, if you say I was born male, but I feel female, we're all like, that's great. There's a whole group of people that are like, that is not great. That is weird and wrong, and I won't have it. And someone comes along and says, I agree with you. It is also very strange and it shouldn't be happening, and let's make laws against it. It makes them feel seen.
And
it makes
empowered.
them feel heard.
Yeah.
Yes, and empowered, and also not wrong. Like they've been feeling for years like they're bad for being uncomfortable with how fast the world is changing, and that's our education system. That's the slowness of our education. But I think it's also identity, right? If you define yourself by something, I define myself. I am a Christian. That's how I define myself. Like, how would you define yourself, Anthony? If you were going to say, "This is who I am," how would you, like, if you looked in the mirror and you saw yourself, how would you define yourself?
I'm pretty European, you know, like I have a lot of
European.
European influence. And I think that was partly why I moved to America, because I was so disappointed by the Brexit referendum result. And I was like, suddenly I was living in my country, and my country, my people didn't want to be part of Europe, which was designed in the first place to prevent World War III, you know, like making this collection of countries all come together for safety and security. And that's why I saw the Brexit vote very similar to the Trump vote here in America. It was people saying, I don't know why I'm so poor. You know, I work all these hours. I do so much. I'm running 3 jobs. I'm driving Uber at night, and I'm still poor. And so I put everything, Leigh, down to the same fundamental thing, whether it be here in the United States or back in Europe, and that is wages never kept up with inflation. And I can bring all of these conversations, whether it be about, you know, racism or anti-gay sentiment or just the general anger, to the fact that the cost of living went up and up and up and up, and wages have not increased in 50 years. And that you have to put down to government. And fundamentally this kind of idea that people don't need money, or the workers will just carry the cost of everything, you know. And this is why I was so interested in what Bernie Sanders had to say. And he said exactly the same thing for the last 40 years. I mean, Sanders has not swayed at all from his theory, you know, this concept that trickle-down economics just doesn't work, and that people
that concept is proved by economics.
It's proved,
you know?
Right.
It's been proved that it's not just a sentiment that we all could sort of see, you know, as the wage gap got bigger and bigger, and the gap between the rich and poor got bigger and bigger. But Trump and Republicans,
they use it all the time. That's their argument. It's like, if we cut taxes for businesses, then they're going to employ more people, and then that's going to mean that everybody benefits. And it's just not true.
It is straight up propaganda lies, and it never has worked. And all you do is take that money and do stock buybacks and give bigger bonuses to your employers, and you send your company overseas so you can pay people even less money. We can all see that now. We can see that with statistics and with research. But I find it interesting that you said your identity is as a European. You know, you see yourself as a European.
Because we stand for progressive values. You know, that we couldn't conceive of banning abortion in Europe. Like, it's incomprehensible. And in America, this thing was put into law 47 years ago. And yet now it's like, oh, let's go back to that. I mean, it blows my mind, Leigh.
No, well, you asked a question earlier. You said, like, why did these evangelical Christians not say, well, this is out of bounds for me, this grab him by the pussy, and this behavior and the way he behaves around, and it's just so uncouth, and it's not at all Christian. And it goes back to 40 years ago, like you're saying. I mean, when Reagan was elected here in the States, and this is before I moved to the States, I mean, Roe v. Wade has been around my entire adult life. I do not know a world in which abortion was not legal for women. So the fact that they're going to take me back to before I was born just blows my mind. But if you look at the Reagan administration, and I'm not saying I know that much about it, because like I said, I was living in Canada. I was a child back then. But that's where the evangelical Christians got hooked. They had tried a lot of different ways to get the evangelical Christians on board, because they were clearly a large voting bloc. And they had tried many different ways. And the one way they found, and they found this right before the Reagan election, was the abortion issue, right? The killing of babies, the murdering of innocents. And this was something that just appealed. They could see themselves as walking in God's image, as being a savior to children. And they created the one issue voter. And Reagan pushed that. And then you suddenly got this entire voting bloc aligning themselves with the Republican Party over this one issue.
And the
that
branding of pro-life was very clever as well.
Oh,
because
was it not?
it's marketing, isn't it? It's marketing. To say pro-life, it means it's such a loaded phrase.
And what are you if you're the opposite of pro-life?
Right.
If you're pro-death, you're pro-murder, you know? Yeah. And so I've said for years that because Roe has been such a hot button issue for so long, I've been saying for years, like, we should abandon Roe. Our rights to our own body should never be decided by the court. It should be a piece of legislation that Congress passes that gives us the right to our own body. It shouldn't be decided through a court case. It should be a law of bodily autonomy. And I believe it should be a bodily autonomy law because it's about more than just women. We all know that America has its own problem with misogyny. If the law is just for women, we probably won't do it. But if it's for everybody, if we say you have the right to your own body, Anthony, your body is yours to do with what you want to. If you want to have surgery, have it. If you want to have top surgery, have it. If you want to become a different gender, that's on you. If you get a terminal disease and you want to take yourself out of this world, that is your choice to decide. A bodily autonomy law says our body belongs to us from the day we're born to the day that we die. And I think a lot of people could get on board with that. It wouldn't matter what it was. Our body belongs to us. You can't even take my organs from my body if I'm dead, if I didn't agree to it before, right? So, but all of a sudden you can tell me what to do with my alive body? Like, that makes no sense. So,
and it's also old white men that are telling women what to do with their bodies.
I mean, there's rules where they say, oh, you can't have a hysterectomy because your husband might want to have children later. Excuse me? Like, that is the most bananas choice. And there are states that are already doing that. And now we have a state after state after state after state making decisions on abortion laws, on trans laws, on all these things that belong to other people's bodies and calling themselves the party of freedom, right?
But they've done it with no referenda. The thing is, this might be happening in Florida or Texas, but they haven't actually asked the people of Florida or Texas. And in some surveys that have been done, invariably, the majority do not want abortion banned. They do not want to have to go down these far-right directions that really just DeSantis feels that is going to be a vote winner for him. So he's almost sabotaging himself at the ballot box. Is that not right? Like, he hasn't actually reached out to the people to kind of find out if this is what voters want.
Well, here's the thing. It goes back to the thing I was saying about identity. I think people get very confused when you start messing with their identity. If I define myself as a Christian, and that is how I see myself, as a God-fearing woman who will go to heaven, and I go to church, I do the things, I am good. If my church or my religion says we don't do this, and then the law is going to say opposite, then I have to be against the law because I define myself by this. If I define myself as American, a red-blooded American, a can-do attitude, entrepreneurial spirit, freedom above all, and you tell me, well, America actually slaughtered all the natives when we came here, and we don't have a really terrific history, and then we brought in a bunch of slaves to build the country. You go, don't tell me America's in a racist country. Don't tell me America slaughtered all. I didn't do that. I'm an American, and I'm not racist, and so then people lose their mind because you're not talking about the issue anymore. You're talking about them. You're talking about them personally, their identity. You're attacking their identity. And so people have lost the ability to discuss issues because they're seeing it through the veil of how they see themselves. So they can no longer talk to you. If you see yourself as somebody who has the right to bear arms, and I start saying, okay, but should we be able to have, and I start having a discussion about the logistics of giving people who have beaten their wife a gun, or somebody who has a criminal record a gun. Nope. I am a Second Amendment warrior. This is the box that I sit in.
Are they not seeing it through the eyes of Greg Abbott or the eyes of Ron DeSantis? I mean, this is my worry because, when you survey Americans as a whole across the country, they're actually quite liberal. They're actually quite progressive. As a country, this is actually not the country that some of these Republican leaders would have you believe. And so that's what makes this so fundamentally unfair, because it serves nobody. And, I've learned, because, obviously when I was reporting, I was on the radio in London for many, many years doing like a talk show. And I covered the inauguration of Barack Obama, and I used to cover his State of the Union speeches. And I foolishly would communicate to the British people that this was a life-changing moment for all Americans, and this was
I thought so
America
too.
putting its racist history behind it, embracing a black man as president, putting a black man in a White House, right? Even that concept I always found kind of interesting. And what I foolishly said was actually, you know, I was inaccurate in my thinking, because I thought that everybody was behind him, and I thought that this phrase of hope and that yes we can speech and all that whole movement galvanized a new America. And what I didn't realize is that half the country was devastated, was furious. They weren't able to express their kind of their racism in good company anymore. And I would say that not half the country, but a good percentage put their hoods in the drawer for 8 years. And we're like, okay, we're going to have to kind of play along with this for a while. Until the orange man showed up and those hoods came back out of the drawer. Except they didn't put them on. They felt that they were able to be these racists in broad daylight. They could execute Ahmaud Arbery in the street in broad daylight. They could press their knee on the neck of George Floyd for 9 minutes in broad daylight and be filmed and think they were going to get away with that because Donald Trump was the president. And so I have had to learn as an immigrant moving to America that this level of division is beyond anything we see in England. Because in England, the left and the right is just at like 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock. You know, it's like, it's very subtle. But in America, the left is actually relatively centrist from my experience as a European. You know, things like
I agree. Yeah.
The Green New Deal is not progressive. The Green New Deal is just normal, right? So that's not considered
it's common sense. The Green New Deal at this point is common sense.
Yeah, whereas no one will say it here. Biden won't allow those words to come out of his mouth, you know, for fear of being, you know, called a liberal. And actually the right in America has embraced the far right and the extreme. And I often say that patriotism has given way to nationalism, which has given way in some cases to Nazism. And that image of Trump at that conference going up to the flag and giving it a hug and doing this kind of fake patriotic hug with the flag was so offensive. I just want to ask you about the media, just to bring it back to the media for a second, because the head of CBS...
if I could speak to you...
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah,
go
before
ahead.
you say that, listen, first you said half the country was devastated by Obama's election. And I would push back a little bit on that, because I actually don't think it's half the country. I think it's...
Well, was it half the voters? Would that be a better...
If you take out the 1/3 of the country that doesn't vote, like that's the part I want to get to, right? Like there's a third of there's 1, 2, 3/3 of the country. One whole third doesn't vote at all. So you know, you're working with 2/3 to begin with. And so 1/3 of the country was devastated. And in some ways, I think it's because, and it goes back to what we were saying about identity, that you've been told your whole life that people who have racism in the way America does in its background, and like you said, I'm an immigrant too, and it surprised me. We had our son in his little bumbo in front of Obama's inauguration, and we were like crying, this is a totally new world he's going to be in. And, you know, I had the same foolish ignorance that it was going to be better, that we were stepping into a better world. But 1/3 of the country has very deep ties to racism, but also they have deep ties to believing the South didn't go to war for slavery, that the South went to war for state pride and for the South. And they've been taught that in school. This is generations of white supremacy and white patriarchy passed down. It's a terrible history that we have in many ways. And if you've been told your whole life that being white makes you better, that it doesn't matter that you're not doing well, that you're poor, that you are not as educated as some other people. It's one of the reasons they like to come at elites, coastal elites, you know, this idea that being educated is somehow a bad thing. Whereas lots of us who came to the coast, we came via many different routes. So it's actually, what's elite about it is staying in your own town for your whole life. And that's pretty elite. You're only hanging out with certain kind of people. But this idea that you are better, that you are somehow better by nature just by being white. And then all of a sudden, here is this man as the president of the United States with his lovely family and his education and his Harvard degree and all of his pedigree, speaking beautifully about hope and the American dream. And you think, somewhere in your brain, if you have been told it does not matter how badly you're doing, at least you're white. And all of a sudden, it's not better to be white. Here is this person that by all measures is better than all of us, right? He's the president of the United States. He's the most powerful man in the world. If the most powerful man in the world is a Black man, what does that say about me? And I think it messed people up. And they couldn't square that circle, that I am better circle. And then there was just this huge pushback. There's no way he's legal to be president. He's not even American. He didn't do this. There had to be reasons that this man became president, because it couldn't possibly be that a Black man could be this successful. That's not possible. Except it was. And then he was elected again. And then they could get rid of him. And they chose the polar opposite, the absolute. And listen, I'll tell you, between you and me, I'm not entirely sure the country did choose Donald Trump. I have to be very honest. I think your Brexit that made you run for the hills from the UK, I think our election here, I think this all has Putin's hands all over it. I think it has autocracy all over it. I think it has this long-term push to minimize the West and democracy in general all over it. I think their hands are all in it.
Well, it's been proven. It's been proven. It's in the Steele dossier.
So I'm not
it's
even
in the
entirely sure that the majority of the
Yeah.
country chose him. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But at the
Yeah.
end of the day, he became our president, and
Yeah.
he became what America. I mean, to me, he was everything everything Europeans hate about Americans, right there in a person, right? When I would travel as a Canadian and people would be like, are you American or Canadian? I was like, oh, I'm Canadian, but I'm married an American and I love him. He's everything about the American can-do attitude. I can do it. He's a military kid, like everything that you would hope for in America without that kind of why would I live anywhere else blinders that Americans have. So Americans can be wonderful, the entrepreneurial spirit, all the things that have been created by America. But Trump represented everything gross about America: excess, greed, patriarchy. I'm going to go back to greed. I think it's the worst part of him. And he had no time for America in general. That man had no interest in America.
It's ironic, isn't it, that he talks so much about, great patriots, great genes. This person loves America, and I look at this guy and I'm like, he doesn't love America. I mean, I've been living here for 5 years. I chose to move to America. I love America. I have no desire to go and live back in England. I adore this country, but I also recognize that it's a country that has failed to self-critique. In England, we're very self-deprecating. We take the mickey out of each other all the time. We are constantly we're the underdogs, we're like on the down. And I believe that being bombed between 1939 and 1945 helped us recognize that fascism was just over there. We could hear it coming. We could hear the air raid siren. We could hear the sound of the doodlebugs overhead. The Blitz spirit, it's often referred to, people's resilience against Nazi Germany. That's never happened here in America. There's not been a mainland war where you have been in fear of an enemy. And so a modern Cold War, as you describe in 2016, there's no doubt that America's election was meddled with because it was a social media election. It was born of people looking on Facebook to get, to read policy. Instead of going to the Democrats' website, they'll see memes that have been posted by Russian infidels. We're looking at a very unfair landscape now. And it was the same with Brexit in England. And in fact, you could argue that any democratic country now has very little chance of a fair and free election because of social media and these huge companies' failure to kind of prevent people from access to false or misleading information. But I'm very interested in this American inability to self-reflect. And is it American exceptionalism that prevents people? Because if anyone like would listen to me, they'd be like, well, you're a British guy. How dare you come here and criticize America, you know? And it's like, I'm criticizing elements of America because I love America and I want America to be better. I know it can be. And I don't see it as criticism. I see it as debate. And this failure here to debate, we don't talk, we don't volley. People think you must be in a side. And I think it starts in schools, putting kids into teams and making them do like after school activities. And you're either in this team or you're a cheerleader for that team. And we don't have this in Europe. And so people are divided from their very earliest days in education. And they are relied upon to pick a side. And that's very alien to me.
Well, here's the thing. You and I are both immigrants. This is not, American exceptionalism belongs to America. I grew up in Canada, where we were the fun, nice neighbor of the big, huge winner, right? I mean, if you think about it as being a house, Canada's like, yeah, we live next door to America. They're cool. Like you have to be self-deprecating. You have to be kind of funny. You don't have the power, but you have power by proximity and everyone kind of just likes you and you're sort of like the nice friend. But the problem with American exceptionalism, just conceptually, if you think about school children, let's back it up even. You're talking about the UK. England, in general, it took over the world. You guys were the world superpower for forever, right? You had all of the colonies. You started Canada, thank you so much. Australia and your Indias. And you guys were the top dog. And
we're a tiny country, tiny
hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And yes, you lived through the war, you lived through the Blitz, you lived through all these things, but you also lived through being on top and then not being on top, right? You're still an important country, but you're not like the man anymore. And for a long time, England was the man.
Sure. America
is a far younger country, right? Like we always used to laugh when we go to Europe and they'd say, oh, the restaurant's in kind of an old building, and this restaurant's in like a building that was there for 1,500 years. And you're like, oh, we have hospitals from 1971, North America is so young. North America as it is, the indigenous people would be like, no, we were here for a long time. But North America as we know it, America as we know it is very young. And I always say that, I believe America's in its teenage years. I believe it's acting up. I believe it's trying to say, look at me and I don't need you. And we're acting like total assholes, like we know everything. And I always say, if you're in school and your kid is the best looking kid, he's the richest kid, he's the most powerful kid, if that kid goes to school and tells everyone how rich and cool and important he is, that kid is an asshole. So what you have to do if you happen to be the richest, smartest, coolest kid is be generous. You have to be humble. Everyone can say, well, you're richer than all of us. You're like, oh, don't worry about it. Like, let me help you out with this. Let me help you out. America has never done that. America keeps telling you it's the greatest country in the world. We're the greatest country in the world. Oh, Lord, can you imagine some child telling you they're the greatest kid in the school? You'd be like, shh, don't do that. Yeah. America's done that for so long that it's bought its own press, right? There's a fair amount of people that have bought their own press. And so when you start saying, well, actually you did this, and actually you did this, and actually this part of your history isn't so great. So you have all these states now trying to take history out of schools so we don't know that we're not so great. That is obscene. Yeah. And it also, I think, you want to be the greatest country in the world, but you don't want to educate your children? How are they supposed to compete on the world stage if they don't even know what happened in their own country? You take an American child to Canada and you're like, I don't know, what was slavery, right? You're going to look like an absolute fool. You can't go to Europe. You can't go around the world. So this idea that we're not going to teach kids things that'll make them uncomfortable, well, you're not going to teach kids anything then, because America's history is filled with uncomfortable things. But that's how you grow. England's history is filled with uncomfortable things. But that's
it's the worst.
Grow.
I mean, it's full of atrocities. But
right?
but there is something fundamental about our ability in England to self-reflect. And yes. I think that, and that's why.
Do you think that's an age thing? Do you think that it's because England is more mature?
Maybe, and maybe a country does need to be around for a good few hundred years before it starts to kind of work out who it is and what its identity is. And when you ask me what is my identity, it's like, a country will take time to find its own identity because America is an experiment, right? It's often referred to as the experiment. And there's a lot of scholars and scientists now who are looking at this and they're saying maybe the experiment has failed. And maybe it requires a reboot. And there are others that say maybe Donald Trump was entirely necessary because otherwise we were going to carry on in this, way of just taking ourselves for granted. And what he's done, I mean, I have no doubt that in the 2024 general election, more people will vote than ever before. I think we've now engaged people in a way where they're like the consequences of not voting are so significant. And you will see that now just in the, with the gerrymandering that's been going on and the redrawing of boundary lines and Republicans trying to weaponize these districts so that they can win because they know they can't win with their candidates and maybe they can win by cheating. And actually,
well, they cannot win by ideas. If you can no longer win with your ideas, and
because
you can
there's
no
no policy, is
there?
Candidate. Yeah,
there's
no policy.
For?
It's just eradicate everything that went before. Let's come out of the Iran nuclear deal. Let's come out of the Paris Climate Accord. Let's break down all of the environmental protections. And so, unfortunately, we need, because I'm very keen to talk about solutions. I don't like to just moan about it because I really genuinely believe
I feel the same way. I feel the same way.
We can be hopeful, and I want to be hopeful. And
we both believe in the country. We both believe in this country. That's the thing. And sometimes I do think it takes an outsider to say, we're both immigrants. And when I talk to Alexander Vindman, he's also an immigrant. We all love America. We all believe in what it can stand for. We all believe in the experiment of democracy and the pursuit of life and liberty and happiness and this can-do spirit and the entrepreneurial spirit and making it better. And I think the problem is that we are living in this world where Americans, people who have grown up here, who have lived here their whole lives, have either forgotten it's something they need to fight for, forgotten how great what they have actually is, or they want it to be the way it was back in whatever they're thinking of. Because when I think this whole concept of make America great again, and I'm like, when was it great for everyone? It was never great for everyone, right? It was great for one group of people.
Yeah.
One sex of people, and by proxy, maybe the white women, right? Yeah. But not even great because they couldn't have their own credit cards, they couldn't do their own things. Like it was never great for anyone except straight white men with power, right? So if that's the great we're going back to again, why would any of us want to do that, right? We must progress. And I think sometimes it takes outsiders to be like, hey, what you've got is amazing. Like, let's not
because we have
it.
Perspective, because we, it's maybe easier for immigrants to do this. And, this is why I feel like it's okay now to kind of speak out loud, because for the first 3 years that I did 5-Minute News, I didn't want to share my opinion. I just wanted to put the facts on the table. I'm continuing to do that
Which is useful, and I hope you will continue to do that.
And I shall.
Need to know facts.
But I also recognize that we need some context. And this is why at the beginning of the program I referred to the American media in some ways as being no different to the propaganda that Putin has been spreading across Russia for 22 years and more. And this is why we have a whole generation of people growing up thinking in Russia that he is actually the goodie and not a baddie. And that's why it's going to take an awful lot to convince the Russian people that Ukraine is not the aggressor and that Volodymyr Zelensky is a goodie and that actually Ukraine was free until Russia showed up. And do you think it's fair to equate the similarity between, because the division in America is so great, families have been broken apart. I've lost one of my very best friends, he's very like anti-vax and anti-mask, and he and I, we fell out because I accidentally referred to him as, I said, you've been radicalized. And he did not want to hear that. And I regret saying that. And I've apologized to him since, but he doesn't want to be my friend anymore. And I feel very, very sad that, what's happened in society, a pandemic should be a thing that brings people together. It shouldn't be a thing that separates us. And yet it's been politicized. The quote is of Trump saying, well, the coronavirus, it's the Democrats' new hoax. And hearing those words said out loud so early on, I think that was around, March 2020. And I was like, uh-oh, like this is bad. This is going to get really bad. And now, of course, DeSantis in Florida has banned vaccines for the youngest age group, saying that, children can't be vaccinated. That awful thing he said a few weeks ago with, take your masks off, it's COVID theatre, they don't do anything. I mean, it's almost as if the truth is irrelevant. It's about, getting people on your team. So how do we overcome this? How do we communicate with our friends and our family without losing them as friends? How do we reignite that kind of sense of Americanism as being what binds us rather than politics, which divides us?
Yeah. It's a tough question. It's the question of the hour, right? I think that one of the things you have to look at is how, I don't think you were wrong, unfortunately, saying your friend had been radicalized, because I think that's what experts would call it. When when science goes out the window for opinion, that's a form of radicalization. When you are reading things that are not based in fact, but based in opinion, and then basing your health on those opinions, that is a form of radicalization. So I think we first have to decide how far down the rabbit hole these people are. I will say, I've always said that we are responsible for our people. So we have to have the difficult conversations. We have to have those uncomfortable conversations with our parents or our brothers or our sisters or our best friends, people that are close to us. And I've been doing it for years and it drives people bananas. But over time, you can, provided people aren't deeply, deeply radicalized. Most people just don't understand, or they're watching the wrong news channel. And you can get them piece by piece. I got my mom almost right away. I started explaining things to her. And she was like, well, yeah, no, that's what I think. And that's what I think. And that's what I think. And I said, well, you're voting with dad. But like, if I tell you this is what these policies are and these, and she was like, well, I'm on this side. I was like, well, then you should be voting that way.
I did the same
my
with
mom.
my
I could get her right
yeah.
away.
Yeah.
My dad, no kidding, took a decade of me pushing at him about things. And honestly, I think it came down to the fact that he is now deeply concerned about my son's future because he loves my son. And I'm trying not to take that personally, but he adores my son. He is definitely the most important person in his life. And he wants to save the future for Lachlan. So he starts looking at the environmental policies of these, people he would never, he voted with his wallet. He's very conservative the whole way, businessman, lawyer, this kind of thing. But now he's looking, he's like, well, no, we need to save the planet for Lachlan, and we need to do these things for Lachlan. It needs to be open for Lachlan. So he took me almost a decade of pushing at him, telling me climate change wasn't real and it was all this stuff. You can get people. You just have to find a way in. My father-in-law is an absolute military hero. He's just marvelous. Career Navy, lieutenant commander, just did so many amazing rescues. He's just terrific. And he lived in England for a long time. They lived in Cornwall when my husband was young. And he was the very last one we got. We got my mother-in-law, and then we finally got my father-in-law. And it was because we would show him, these are the people you like. These are the values you have in the world. This is who you are. But he always thought he was a military guy, so he was Republican. And we would explain to him, the Republican Party isn't the party that you know. It's left you. It's left Republicanism. Look at all these people you looked up to. They were calling it out. It took us a long time. And you have to decide if A, the relationship is worth it, B, if the person isn't too far gone. Because my favorite aunt and uncle are so deep down the Fox News rabbit hole that it breaks my heart. I cannot get them. And look what I do. I do this all day long. I cannot get them. The things they say, when people start saying things, you go, oh dear. There's just no way to reach them. And my father used to say, don't argue with crazy people. And I think that you get to a certain point where you're like, okay, I'm never going to convince you. And that would be a waste of my time. So get your people, be responsible for your people, get the ones you can. And then we need to go after that 1/3 of voters who don't pay attention, who don't vote. Because no one's equating them. They're saying, oh, we're going to gerrymander this district. You were talking about gerrymander. We're going to gerrymander this district because there's this many Republicans, or we're going to get all this district. But they're not equating the 1/3 of people who aren't voting, right? Those people have not been accounted for. So those of us who believe in the future of the country, who believe in the future of democracy, who believe in the power of choosing your own government and making them leave if they don't represent you. Those of us who believe in a pluralistic society, of a multi-racial society, of a society that includes all religions or no religions, we must reach out to those people that are paying no attention, because they'll change the whole game. And we need people to understand that what we're looking at right now isn't Republican versus Democrat. It's not red versus blue. And Americans are very tribal. They're very, my team, like, I'm going to follow the Red Sox no matter how many times they freaking lose. Americans are very loyal to their team. And unfortunately, politics has become sports, and it's not sports. If we learned anything from the pandemic, it's how important government is. It defines every part of our life. If we can leave our house during a pandemic, if we wear masks, if we get vaccines, if we are alive, the government decides that. So the fact that you say we had Trump talking in March 2020, it's the Democrats' new hoax, he politicized a virus. Viruses are not political. They don't care if we're red or blue or black or white or green or whatever. They don't care. They're viruses. Their whole job is to infect as many of us as possible and multiply. That's their job. And there's people that say, if aliens attacked us now, we wouldn't even come together. They'd be like, the Democrats invited the aliens. We'd be terrible.
Yeah.
And we need to find a way to come back together. And that comes back to your people. If every person that felt passion for American democracy just took charge of their people, it would make such a huge difference. And it seems small. It seems like, what does it matter if I can get my grandmother to change her vote? Well, it does matter, because that person then talks to their friend, and then their friend talks to. It's a slow process. It's not a pretty process. But what we're being offered, what the alternative is, if it's Trump, if it's DeSantis, who is Trump light, if it's Tucker Carlson, which, as brilliant Steve Smith said, is going to be more likely, because it's Trump on steroids. You know what I mean? We probably won't go from Trump to Trump light. I was like, it's going to be DeSantis. And Steve Schmidt was like, it's not. It's going to be someone like Tucker, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. We've got to a point now where people are just all in, they're like all in. It's
teams.
Like, I don't
Think
just...
of it like teams.
Yeah, and so they've got beyond the point of no return. And so it's like, well, I can't intellectualize how this needs to change, so I'll just arm myself with a well-stocked militia, and I will stand strong. And I fear that we're actually, and maybe the media has a part to play in this, but we are no closer to a solution. We are no closer to a place of relative peace and harmony than we were 5 years ago. And I worry that Biden, we haven't really mentioned Biden. Isn't that interesting? We've been chatting for a while. And we haven't mentioned Biden, but I feel like he is a relic of a bygone era. This desire to do things in a bipartisan way with a team that don't want to play by the rules. And my feeling is, well, if they're not going to play by the rules, make new rules, abolish the filibuster, pass voting rights, do it before infrastructure.
I think they would have. I honestly believe that they would have abolished the filibuster. The filibuster has got to go. You sit down, you go, what in the hell is this thing still doing here? Talk about a relic. Yeah. And they would have. And unfortunately, this is what people don't understand. You say the Democrats are in charge. Okay, well, they're in charge. If they have 50 votes, you lose one of those, you're not in charge, right? And there are two senators who, in my opinion, are clearly bought and paid for, but who are not playing for the team. Yeah. And I believe that if we get, in the midterms, you get a couple more Democratic senators in there, I promise you, I could almost guarantee that filibuster is gone. Because there are so many things we need to pass. We need to pass voter protections. We need to pass the rights of women. We need to pass, there's all these things that they want to pass. The Green New Deal, Build Back Better. These bills are all amazing. And the last thing the Republican Party wants is to show that government is capable. The government can help your life. The government is competent. And with more Democratic senators, if you hold the House and you get a couple more Democratic senators and you negate the voices of Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin, and look, Joe Manchin makes sense to me. It's from a red state. He's going to represent the coal industry. It's sort of like, I love him, but he makes a lot more sense to me than
he's admitted to being a conservative. And,
Sure.
Even
And
during the State of the Union speech, he even sat with the Conservatives.
Sat with them. I know, so
right?
cheeky.
I was
but
like,
this Kristen is like, Cinema.
Yeah.
I know, you're like, what are you, come on.
Yeah.
But the man lives on a yacht. So like, okay.
Right.
But at least he's a pro-union guy. He votes for the Democratic justices. People are like, oh, just go and sit with, if you're going to be with the Republicans, just be a Republican. You're like, no, don't, because then we wouldn't have control of the Senate. We wouldn't decide what bills come to the floor. We need him to stay as a Democrat. We just need more Democrats. And then I think you would see actual change. And the problem with actual change for the Republicans is they can't just be like, look at these losers who get nothing done, right? Like, we would get a lot done. And then what would you say? You'd be like, well, what are you offering me? Because they just gave me this, and they gave me childhood tax credits, and they fixed my roads, and they did that. They don't want us to be competent. That's why they want the virus to continue. That's why they want us fighting about masks. What is this trucker convoy doing? What are they even protesting? They're literally now sitting in a parking lot, and you're like, what's the goal here? No, mask mandates. Well, we don't have them anymore. Vaccine mandates. Well, you don't. 90% of truckers are vaccinated. In Canada, where it started.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. It's about being angry and stopping progress. So what we have to do is be like, this is very irritating. I do not like it, but I have to get more people to vote for Democrats. And believe me, I'm all over the Democrats. They do a lot of dumb things. You said we haven't spoken about Biden. I do think Biden is someone from a different era, but I don't believe there was anyone else that could have beaten Trump in 2020. Because there was nothing for the Republicans to glom onto. There was nothing for them to play their cards on. He's white. He's old. He's straight. He's Christian. He goes to church. You know what I mean? Like, there was nothing for them to be like, oh, look at this terrible woman. Look at this person of color. Look at this. They didn't have it. He was everything they say they want, right? So to beat Trump, I believe it had to be Biden. To beat the rising autocracy in America, we might need something else. However, I don't think we're giving Biden enough credit because that recovery bill was incredible.
Well, maybe really Biden doesn't give Biden enough credit. Maybe that's the issue.
Democrats are terrible at bragging. We're very terrible at bragging. We're not particularly good at being like, I did this. It just doesn't fit the brand.
Right.
But that recovery bill really turned the country around. The infrastructure bill, God bless him, it was bipartisan. He actually got it done. We've been talking about infrastructure week for 2 decades, and it's been done. On any other president's watch, that would be a huge, huge boon. And yet we're still bitching about stuff. Oh, well, he still hasn't paid my student loan, so fuck him, right? It's not, he's being actually very successful. And if you give him a couple more senators, and they get rid of the filibuster, and they pass Build Back Better, and their climate change plans, and they make the child tax credit permanent, and they raise minimum wage, and they do all these things that 2 senators are holding back, then you show me how Republicans get back in power with no policy, no plans, and a mouthful of hate. Because I think they're even shooting themselves in the foot with this abortion thing. They've been running on one issue for 40 years. All right, you're going to get rid of it. That's going to piss a lot of people off right before the midterms, because they'll probably get rid of it in June. And then what? What's your one issue now, my friends? Okay, you took our rights to our own bodies from us. I don't like that, and neither do my friends, and we're going to vote against it. But also, now what? What are you offering if it's not saving babies, right? And I find that the Republicans right now, it's almost like I used to say it was a little bit like they knew something we didn't know. How can you pass bills that are so truly unlikable and think you're still going to win unless you've already got the win in the bag? I question a lot of these elections, and you see what happened in Florida and how Ron DeSantis won, and how many votes he won by, and how they had Democrats.
Yeah, it's cheating. I mean, fundamentally, no one wants to say it out loud, but there is a lot of cheating that is now going on. People have had to rely on that.
Yeah, and that's what you and I are here for, to say it out loud, because we're not getting corporate salaries from boardrooms of people that don't want to say it out loud because
you used to not be able to say in the media that someone was lying. So they came up with this word falsehoods. It drove me crazy because, if you say someone is lying, then they can sue you. But to say it's a falsehood, you can get around it. And I
Yeah.
was like, this is remarkable, because what you're doing, and this was encouraging the rise of Trump. And we need to finish, but I just want to mention this quote, which I was going to
You and I
mention
could
about.
talk forever.
We could talk forever, and maybe we'll
I
come
know.
back and do it. We'll do it again
People are
another
like,
time.
oh my God, this is like a 4-hour podcast.
But the head of CBS, not anymore, because he had to resign in 2018 for sexual harassment. But this is Les Moonves, who in 2016 said about Donald Trump, he said, "It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS." And isn't that really the fundamental problem that we have here? When we bring this story back to how we started, talking about the media and how because I grant the media as being the sector that gave rise to Donald Trump. You know, people didn't watch these channels until he showed up, and suddenly they were like, advertising was through the roof. And so we really need to recognize that people do have a choice now. They can go to PoliticsGirl or they can go to 5 Minute News. They don't have to watch CBS News at 9 o'clock in order to kind of see what's happening in the world. You know, there are...
In many ways, they shouldn't watch a lot of shows if they want to know what's happening in the world.
Right.
I love NPR, and I was just listening to them before we got on here. And they were like, as you know, most midterm elections, the party in charge loses seats. And so the Democrats... And I thought, why are you preaching old tropes about how it's always been in the past? And so
because
Joe
it's
Biden
lazy.
should probably...
It's laziness, Lee.
It's exhausting.
It's not journalism.
It's not even
pure
based
laziness.
in reality. Yeah, it's not even based in reality. You want to run a real race? Like, you want to know how it's really going? Like, these people are trying to stop women from leaving their state. Run on that. Right? Yeah. They're trying to stop children from learning history. Run on that. If you can't win on people that refuse to take care of each other or want to traumatize our children for being different, then I don't know what you're doing. But to just say, oh, you're going to lose because this is what typically happens at midterms. And I thought, oh, Lord, you're a good news station. What are you doing?
Yeah.
And
the pollsters are always wrong, aren't they? The Nate Silvers of this world, they're always wrong. And I think that is something very interesting. And in fact, there was a study done, I forget which publication it was, but it basically studied the opinion of these talking heads type people, people who go on the news to give their opinion. And it was a university, they took all of this information and they worked out that nothing that all of these thousands of people said that went on these news channels to fill the airtime with this churn, nothing they said was based in reality. Nothing came true. It was all hearsay. It was all false predictions. It was all lazy opinion. And we are wasting our time thinking that cable news is educating us. We really need to go looking. The first thing we can do is go to the website of the political parties and actually read the policies. I mean, literally from the horse's mouth. And I just don't think people do that. They've been voting for personality for too long. And so, what do you think of Joe Biden? It's like, well, who cares? Politics should be boring. Politics should be dull. It should be efficient. It should be from a place of like truth. And I think that's the one thing that I credit Biden with, is that I think he's a good person. I don't think he's in the pockets of big business. I don't think
I think he's innately a truly good person. I agree.
He's a lifelong public servant. The guy was a public defender. This is a guy who has given his life to public office, and yet people criticize him and go, well, he's just a politician, and presume that if you are a politician, then you are inherently bad, in the same way that they now do that with journalists. And that's the tragedy, is that good journalists, and I have friends who are great journalists, and they will literally they will put their lives on the line for the truth. And this is really where we need to get to now, I guess, in America. And let's just kind of end with this, is maybe we need to do more. Instead of criticizing that gas prices are rising, we need to say, something, okay, they might go up to 27 cents. But if that's what I have to weather for the people of Ukraine to have their freedom back, then it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think ultimately you have to go back to motivation. If you're going to, at the end of the day, what motivates you? If you are on the news and you're there for your giant paycheck and you will do whatever your board tells you to do, then you're no longer the news. You are a talking head, you're entertainment, and people should recognize that. If there are 18 people talking at the same time on CNN, you're not learning anything, move along. And I think the thing is that we let news become entertainment. We let our politicians become entertainment. There are lots of great journalists, and they're doing marvelous work. I love The Atlantic magazine. I love Mother Jones. I love The Guardian. There's great work out there. And the same thing, there are so many politicians. I could make a list of politicians that are in it for the right reasons, that are doing it for the right reasons, that are attempting to make our world better. If I ran for office, that was what I hope I would be doing. But it's about motivation. Why are you there? Why are you speaking? What is your point? And I think we need to remember that, and look at Donald Trump. They're saying he's your front runner for 24. Why is he there? For himself. What is he looking for? To, improve his brand, his vision, his pocketbook. What is his point? His point is to make Trump a brand for life. None of that has to do with America. So why would you vote for that to lead you? I think you need to go back to your motivation. Why are you doing it? You're doing what you're doing for a specific reason. So people have information, the true information. I'm doing what I'm doing for a specific reason, because people are lost and they need to know what direction to look. And I'm going like, what, let's look over here. And this is why you should look over here. I'm not doing it because I've been told to. I'm doing it because it needs to be done. And I think we're filling a gap in a market that people are starving for. And I think, broadcasting would be smart to look at what people actually need instead of constantly telling us what they think we want to hear, because it's making us ill. And politicians should do the same thing.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate you genuinely and the work that you do. Let me remind people that you can subscribe to PoliticsGirl on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast, and also the 5-Minute News Daily audio podcast, which drops in the early hours of the morning every morning. So it's there when you wake up and you can listen to it whilst you're making your coffee. I'm Anthony Davis. Join me next Sunday morning with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5-Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Time.